Welcome to Smart Talk, a series of interviews with world-leading economists. In this episode, I have the honor and pleasure of interviewing Professor John Roemer. Dr. Roemer is the Elizabeth S. and A. Varick Stout Professor of Political Economy at Yale University. Dr. Roemer wrote his book, Free to Lose, in 1988. Here he proves that the initial and subsequent distribution of capital is the most significant factor in determining future incomes and wealth. This assertion has proved most significant in explaining the current distribution of wealth and income in the world today. In other words, he who has continues to get. Join me in a discussion with one of the most important theoretical economists in the world. I'm Andrew Mazzone, president of the Henry George School of Social Science, and this is Smart Talk. Well, Professor Roemer, glad you're with us. For the audience, we wanted to interview John Roemer because we think he covers in his book, Free to Lose, the most essential questions on how to organize and think about society. So he's a professor at Yale, and the book is a little dense in terms of difficulty, but it really covers all the essential issues that are debated every day in the world, and people don't realize that John Roemer has dealt with these issues in an intellectual way, and so we're going to pick his brain kind of in a Marxian sense, a capitalist sense, only peripherally in a Georgist sense, because he bumps into that with some of his thinking and assertions. But Professor Roemer, the first thing that strikes me is, of course, in Free to Lose, that you essentially say that capital is the dominant factor, and that if there's an unequal distribution of capital in society, those people who have that favored distribution essentially are going to win the game at the end of the day, regardless of the gyrations that the economy will go through. That essentially, in a deep sense, the game is determined by that distribution of capital, and there's nothing necessarily evil about that in the beginning, but it becomes all determining in the end. And would you care to elaborate on that? Essentially, well, it's an anti-Marxist position in a way, but
this book was written it was published, I think, in 1988, which is 28 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the book by Thomas Piketty that was published 2 years ago, called Capital in the 21st Century, Piketty did some wonderful empirical work, historical work, over the last 20 years or so, tracing what the distribution of ownership of capital has been in a number of countries in the world, particularly the advanced countries, the United States and the European countries. And the basic lesson of his book is that capital is again on the ascendancy after a slight pause caused by the First and Second World Wars and the Great Depression. So that the fraction of the concentration of capital, which is to say the amount of capital owned by the very top echelons of society, the top 1% or the top 1/10 of 1%, is higher than it has been since before World War I. I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but I think that the top 1% of Americans now own, what is it? You may know the figure.
35% to 40%.
30% of total capital. And that's a figure, I think, that was only the last time it was that high was in 1914.
Right.
So capital is reestablishing itself after hard times, which were caused by the wars, the world wars, and the Depression, and is now on the trajectory to be as powerful as it was in the 19th century. So I think in that sense, the Marxist predictions, which I think were wrong on a number of points, have been quite accurate. That this increasing inequality is not something that we've been talking about politically for the last few years, is not a flash in the pan. It's going back to the natural behavior of a capitalist society and economy.
Well, let me just say that Professor Roemer in his book gives some theoretical examples which almost prove the inevitability of what he just described empirically, that capital, if you trace the logic, has such a dominant position relative to labor that eventually it works out to fulfill what Piketty found to be true. And I think Piketty finds that to be true over 200 years with the exception of major wars. And of course you have some, we'll talk about it, you have some moral discussions about that particular point. But one of the things you do mention with the maldistribution of capital, you say that can arise almost accidentally, even if people started off with the same endowment, that essentially with unequal abilities, for example, or different preferences and savings, essentially you could equalize that distribution and have an unequal distribution evolve over time. And so that it almost becomes an inevitability that unequal distribution of capital as a prior is going to exist. Your comment on that?
I think that's true. Capital is just a synonym for wealth. It means the total value of all productive assets that can be traded on markets. So it doesn't include the value of labor, because it doesn't include the value of your human capital, because you can't sell your human capital on a market. It does, however, include the value of all the stock, of financial wealth, real estate, and so on. Okay. Now, and so it's very good for a society to have a lot of wealth. Obviously, it makes the society more secure. The problem is when it becomes extremely concentrated in the hands of a small number of people. And the injustice of that concentration comes from the fact that not all people have the same opportunities to accumulate capital. Some people started off with inheritances from their wealthy parents. Perhaps even more important than that, some people have very advantaged upbringings in families that care a lot about education and pour a lot of resources into their children. Other people don't have those advantages. They don't have parents who are well educated or have resources to inject in them. And also people are born with different natural talents, which is purely a matter of luck, in my opinion. I don't think a person has a moral right to live better than other people because of the luck of the birth lottery, which includes principally two kinds of luck: the luck of the family that you were born into and the wealth and education that it has, and the luck of your genetic endowment. So the basic injustice of capitalism is that it allows these kinds of luck to be parlayed into tremendous financial wealth, and for some people, and poverty for other people who don't have those resources. So I want to make clear, I'm not against the accumulation of wealth for a society. I'm all for that. But I think the problem with capitalism is that the wealth is extremely unequally distributed. And the goal of socialism is to somehow come up with a way of running an economy which has the wealth distributed more or less equally in the society.
All right, let me ask you this. Essentially when you do your analysis, you use a two-factor model, capital and labor, which essentially comes from Marx, his original econometric work as a two-factor model. I just wanted to get your opinion on capital, the makeup of capital. We Georgians would argue that those assets that are from nature, land, natural resources, would act differently in an economic analysis than it would be if it was congealed into man-made capital and analyzed as one factor, including the two. We argued with Piketty on that point. Essentially, we did an interview with Yanis Varoufakis on Piketty, critiquing Piketty's book. What is your opinion on doing the analytical work you do? Is a two-factor model, and it illustrates many of the points we'll talk about. But the fact that the two-factor includes land rental assets, we argue is misleading if you impact it or pack it in with man-made capital. I wanted to get your opinion on that from an analytical point of view.
I think from an analytical point of view, the difference between land and natural resources on the one hand and factories on the other, or produced wealth in that sense, is not terribly important. So I don't agree with you on that.
Okay.
I don't agree with the Georgist position. The difference, of course, there is a difference. Produced capital machines and so on can more or less easily be produced at any level that one wants to do so, if one has the wealth to do it. Whereas land is limited. Now you can improve land and so on, but land and natural resources are limited. So they are different in that sense from produced capital. But I don't think there's particularly a moral difference between the ownership of land and the ownership of movable capital.
Not a moral difference, but a functional difference. And we would argue that land and resources has a better ability to capture monopoly than, let's say, man-made capital, which theoretically can be reproduced and competitively, dealt with. So only in that sense, and we don't make a moral issue of that. We just say that from an analytical point of view, one is more easily replicated and therefore has a less likely monopoly inherence to it than man-made capital. That would be our distinction. Yeah. But
well, there are two reasons that land might be associated with monopoly or anything, also produced capital. One is that it's all owned by a very small number of people, and the other is that there are increasing returns to scale, so that it's economically efficient to have it owned by a single person or controlled by a single firm. Put it that way. I don't think that I don't think the second reason holds for natural resources. I'm not familiar with arguments that say there are vast increasing returns to scale in the use of land or natural resources.
No.
It seems to me that's not true.
That's not true.
And the ownership issue is a purely political issue. How do we decide that society should own its natural resources? Should we allow it to be concentrated in the hands of a small number of people, or should it be owned by the state, or should it be owned by individuals, each having their own share? I mean, these are political questions. So I don't see that there's a natural reason that monopoly is more associated with natural resources than with financial capital and other kinds of firms.
Okay, all right. One of the points you make about capital, of course, that inevitably there's not enough, there's always more labor than capital. Therefore, labor is always in an inferior bargaining position, which results in essentially the ability to generate profits. And my question to you is, I mean, that's an assertion of yours, and it seems to be borne out in reality, but where's the logic? Why does capital always have to be scarce relative to labor? What is the driving mechanism in your mind for that? And Marx would have said, essentially, the reserve army is always being created by technological obsolescence. And Rosa Luxemburg would have said, well, you're going to bring in cheap labor from all around the world. But you're making the assertion, which is quite strong and quite interesting, that with the unequal endowment of capital, it's always going to find more labor, and that labor can generate with that capital a profit. It's an interesting assertion on your part. Would you elaborate on that?
I wish I had an answer. That's a wonderful question. I wish I had an answer to it, and I don't. I just I, like you, have observed that since the advent of capitalism, capital has always been relatively scarce, scarce relative to the labor available for it to employ. Now, as you pointed out, Rosa Luxemburg had a theory that the justification or the explanation of why imperialism occurs, which is the attempt to expand capital's orbit to increasingly large sections of the globe and to encompass more workers in its orbit, is necessary in order for capitalism to maintain in order for capital to maintain its relative scarcity. But I don't think I don't think we can say that capitalism deliberately engages in imperialism to keep labor scarce. It engages in imperialism because it's looking for new markets and so on. And one of the consequences of that is that is that labor remains abundant. But for the deeper question, why is it the case that labor has been historically abundant relative to employment opportunities in the capitalist sector? I don't have a deep understanding of that.
Okay, that's a good. I'm glad you pointed that out, and we're searching for that answer. But let's segue from that into the United States situation of free trade and offshoring. I mean, you discussed that in your book, essentially in the context of that's a way to get labor, excess labor. You mentioned going offshore, and you also mentioned in migration as a way to in effect create a reserve army, which it does, and we see the effects in the United States over the last 30 or 40 years. It's kept labor in check, kept it in place. Now, you also make the assertion, and I think it's a good one, are we more entitled than East Asians to a good standard of living? Or do we have the right to, let's say, protect our standard of living against an inferior standard of living that we found in East Asia when we started the offshoring and outsourcing? Do you have any thoughts on that? Because we, in effect, did do that. We can discuss why we did it, but the question of, the argument today, people will say, well, look, why are you begrudging Chinese workers the opportunity to get a much better job than they had before, even if it doesn't equal the average American, if it, in effect, creates a group of Americans who've lost the old traditional high wages that they once had because the manufacturing was pushed from here back to East Asia, and in-migration was also allowed to, in effect, add to the pressures on labor. Your comments on that?
Well, I think I agree with what you said. I would say it a little more strongly. I think the discussion of the consequences of trade and on the working classes of the advanced countries, in particular in our country, the U.S., in the United States, has been extremely parochial. From a global point of view, I think the most important thing that's happened with respect to distributive justice in the last 30 or 40 years has been the massive income growth of about 1 billion of the poorest people in the world, namely the Chinese. So China has grown at over 9% a year in terms of its GDP since about 1980. And so the incomes, the real incomes of people in China over that last 35, 40 years have risen by a factor of 13. So it's as if you were 13 times as if your income were 13 times as large as your grandparents' income. That's what's happened in China. So they've pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. I mean, some people say as many as 800 million people have leapt out of poverty in China due to this tremendous growth. Now, suppose the consequence of that is that a section of American workers have had their incomes stagnate, which is their incomes have stagnated. That's true, whether to the extent that the consequence of the Chinese growth is not completely established. But let's say that a good fraction or a good part of the responsibility for the stagnation of the growth of income of American workers is the fact that China has taken away markets from the United States by producing manufactured goods that the American workers used to produce. It's not the whole story, but it's certainly part of the story. I still say that overall the consequences are good from the point of view of global justice. Now, is there a way of protecting the American working class and the working classes of advanced countries so that their welfare does not have to be reduced in order to enable the Chinese and the Indian working classes to have a better life. And I think there is. There is. It means we have to educate our workers much more. We have to upgrade the skills of American workers so that they can move into areas which are beyond the frontiers of what the Chinese are doing. We have to work in more sophisticated ways and in more sophisticated industries. We can't make cars anymore because the Chinese can do that very well, or televisions or whatever. So we have to move into much more sophisticated stuff, and that means we have to have a working class which is more sophisticated, better trained, knows more mathematics, and so on. And so and we also have to invest in more infrastructure to make our technology more sophisticated. We are really way behind in infrastructure. Of course, we know this. A lot of people are talking about it. But that's the solution. The solution is not to erect trade barriers which prevent us from importing the Chinese goods. The solution is to upgrade our own infrastructure and working class skills so that we can remain competitive and move on to industries which the Chinese are not in yet.
All right, let me extend that discussion from an American point of view. An argument would be not only were the wages down, but a lot of the jobs were lost. But you would argue that the capital-labor ratio is a very important ratio in economics, and that on analysis, our capital-labor ratio is greater than the Chinese, and therefore the gains of trade somehow are benefiting us better in some global sense. I think you would argue that in your analysis of free trade, the country that can get more labor for less labor is a winner. Now, in America's case, that may be the case, but the gains from that, of course, have not been distributed equally in the society, that they accrue to people who manage money, finance, and so forth, so that there's a distributional problem. But going even further than that, I mean, the history of the United States in its development in the 1800s to the 1900s was one of free trade internally and protectionism externally. And the argument was essentially that although England certainly was in the same position the United States is today relative to China, that the Americans decided it had to learn the technologies that England had on its own so that it could capture the gains from that. And then at some point in time, they could allow free trade when they were the dominant partner. And I think by the 1880s, the United States achieved technical ascendancy by using protectionism and then free trade within the continental United States. And I think the deeper argument is that the learning by doing aspects of capturing that technology were very important for further development, so that if you give away your technology, let's say the United States giving away its manufacturing, that somehow you give away the generative capability to do what you say, educate workers and so forth. But the fact is that the high ground will be held by those who manufacture. At least that's the simple argument on that point. And I would extend that even further, that the United States would have made the argument to free trade and outsource partially to, let's say, disciplined labor, but also I think it had the understanding that World War I and World War II were essentially our target countries like Germany and Japan wanting to muscle their way into the world trade situation, and we basically, with England, fought that off, and then we decided this can't go on this way, that we'd have to basically free trade the world to relieve that pressure. So our agenda there would have been to world peace in one sense and free trade where we had the advantage in another sense. But that we've given up a lot of the high ground in manufacturing. Terms of trade would say that's okay for this point in time, but if that has generative ability to develop new technology, new ideas over time, the argument would be he who manufactures ultimately wins that game in the long term. I know there's a lot of questions buried in there, but your comments on that as an astute observer of the arguments here. In other words, I would say Americans achieved world domination in the 1880s with less than a high school average education. That education is necessary, not sufficient for for world domination. So that the Americans don't have manufacturing, but they get more and more educated. The Chinese would simply do the same thing. Okay.
Well, I mean, the argument you gave is called the infant industry argument, that you may want to protect industries which are just getting started, new industries in a country, so that they don't get wiped out by competition from more sophisticated firms in other parts of the world. And that's, of course, an important argument. One should have infant industry protection, but the kind of protection that people like Trump are talking about is not protecting infant industries, it's protecting geriatric industries.
Right. I understand.
I mean, there's no economic rationale to protect the auto industry in this country, or the industry that makes television sets or textiles. These are not infant industries. They're old industries that require relatively unskilled labor, and they can be produced much more cheaply. The firms that produce those commodities can produce them much more cheaply in countries where labor is less educated and cheaper than it is in the United States. And that's what should be done. Now, the critical thing is you have to make a transition for the workers who were in those industries and lose their jobs. And the way to do that is to tax the people who benefit from the international division of labor, and to redistribute and to take some of the gains they make from globalization, and to invest them in these things we've been talking about, infrastructure and more education for American workers, so that they can move into more sophisticated industries. So it is true, neoclassical economics emphasizes the fact that free trade is good for a nation. That's true, but it didn't break down who it was good for in the nation.
Yes.
If free trade is good for the United States on average, that is to say there are total gains from trade, they can be redistributed so that everybody gains. And that's what hasn't been done. And that's what has given rise largely to the Trump phenomenon, to the support of Trump by American relatively uneducated workers who have seen their income stagnate and who have lost jobs. So the solution is to tax the gainers, the finance people and the big capitalists who make a lot of, who have international, multinational corporations and use cheap labor in other parts of the world, to tax them and to use the taxes to, as I say, upgrade the conditions of work in the United States.
Okay, well, I would argue there we come into the unequal endowment problem of the people who retain the high ground, and we retain the high ground for finance and defense, and in effect we tax the world with our dollar to pay for these goods which are necessary to stabilize the world in a big sense. But the people who work in, let's say, government and finance in America, who are capturing outsized gains, they show no desire to be taxed for the benefit of everybody else. In other words, I can make the argument that they would see themselves as part of an elite structure that can relate to elite structures around the world, but their own people would not seem to have the same priority. And if that's the case, then there's no impetus to tax and equalize for the population that suffered the loss. I think the argument would be, and I would just hazard a guess, that we really don't need those people. We can insulate ourselves away from those people, and that they basically, if we push them up and we subsidize them, they're going to be taking resources at a heavy rate in a world which is now coming to understand that resources are finite. So that all of the pressure would be not to redistribute in the face of your argument, which makes sense. Your argument on that has been called for the last 20 or 30 years and has fallen essentially on deaf ears. So if that's not going to happen, then you're going to have a more and more unequal society, more and more unequal distribution of capital, and therefore, as you have proven logically, the gains cannot flow to anybody else.
No, I don't agree with. I don't think that's correct. I think social movements, people can get organized and they can redistribute the income in their societies. The United States has been the country in which the consciousness concentration of wealth has grown the most rapidly. The concentration has not grown so rapidly in Europe, in the European countries. So after the United States, Britain, the concentration has grown rapidly, but in continental Europe, it has not. It's beginning to start to grow, but they're way behind the United States in the concentration of wealth. And that's because they have strong labor parties, socialist parties, social democratic parties, relatively strong trade unions, and they have redistributed a substantial amount of wealth in those countries. And as I say, don't think of the redistribution as simply paying incomes to poor people. It mainly should take the form of improving the endowments of poor people mainly through education, and also the public endowments, which are good for everybody, which is infrastructure. So I don't think it's inevitable. I think we're now at a very interesting time. It's a very dangerous time with nativism and fascism, neo-fascism and racism and xenophobia increasing on the one hand, but on the other hand also demands for redistribution. I think the Bernie Sanders campaign was a big surprise. I was very happy that Sanders had the kind of big support he had. Now, Sanders is not a super left-wing guy. He's kind of an FDR liberal.
Good point.
But he was calling for things going back to basically the growth of infrastructure, the welfare state, education, a better redistribution of wealth from the very wealthy to the rest of the people in this country, and he had a tremendous response. So on the one hand, there's been a kind of a left-wing response to the global crisis, which has caused a stagnation of incomes in this country for large numbers of people. And on the other hand, there's been a right-wing response with Trump, very dangerous response. But both responses are there, and I'm hoping, of course, that the left response grows, and I think it may. It's just very hard to predict these things.
Right. Well, of course, talking about Germany, you can understand why Germany would have a strong leveling psychology. I mean, they've suffered 2 world wars and basically been crushed in 2 world wars, and I think the population is much more sophisticated in terms of what the likelihood that they would become capitalists en masse and have great wealth. I think the Germans were smart enough to insist upon labor participation as a prerequisite of designing their society. I don't think the American electorate has felt that kind of pain to develop that kind of consciousness. But that's just my comment on that. It's possible, I agree with you, that the Bernie Sanders spontaneous movement was a surprise, more so than I think the Trump movement. Trump movement is understandable. The Bernie Sanders is a movement of young kids who are being educated and look to the future and see that their prospects have been diminished, and they see no other way but redistribution to equal their opportunities. But having discussed that, I wanted to go back to your discussions on Marx, which I think have lots of applicability. You essentially say that Marx, in terms of his understanding of history, kind of got the predictions right, but that some of the salient tenets of his theory are wrong. And I think that's very, very interesting. And I know it's a flashpoint for many Marxist or ultra-left people that you basically have kind of proven that the labor theory of value is really not necessary, to be a Marxist predictor of social trends. And I wanted to discuss the labor theory of value with you. I mean, you essentially model it, and develop the Morishima theory of how to account for labor and capital and how it goes together. The Marxists basically said, well, kind of the same thing, that capital is always going to be in a driving position. There'll always be too much labor. They understand about creating a reserve army, but they can never solve the math of the labor theory of value, so that they basically had to come up with a transformation solution, which is a crude approximation of how you would look at the labor theory of value and basically disprove it. The argument would be that a good Marxist would say that the transformation problem in its mathematical in its mathematical derivation, kind of equalizes the fact that labor, if it's not in a particular industry, by the transformation problem, it's assigned enough labor so that in effect you've got a labor theory of value, just not a one-to-one correspondence on that. Your comment on a very controversial 100-year argument in the Marxist world about the transformation problem and the labor theory of value.
Well, I don't want to talk mainly about the labor theory of value. I think Marx's conception, which was not just Marx's, goes back to Ricardo, was not right. That the basic idea was that the fundamental determinant of prices in a capitalist economy is the labor embodied in the production of the goods produced, which are priced. And I don't think that's a particularly useful theory. I think basically it's a theory that says that it's the costs of production that determine the price.
Right.
A big cost, probably the biggest one, is the labor cost. But the other side of the coin is that demand for goods also has an effect on price. And you need both supply and demand to determine the price. And that's what modern economics has clarified, I think, a great deal. So I don't think the labor theory of value as such was useful. It's not a mathematical problem, the transformation problem. It's the fact that the basic inspiration of was wrong. Now, I think by far the most important thing that I really disagree quite a lot with Marx about is the question of markets. So Marx had an antipathy to markets, and that the consequence of that is that the two big socialist revolutions in the 20th century, namely the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and the Chinese Maoist Revolution in 1949, didn't use prices, shunned prices, tried not to use prices, let's put it that way, not to use a market economy because they felt that markets would regenerate capitalism. And I think that's not right. I think any complex economy needs to use markets. And I think we can use markets under socialism, and we're going to have to. We can't solve all these problems simply by central planning, which dictate how goods should be allocated or even dictate the prices. The issue is how to use markets without having the concentration of wealth develop. And that's the problem. Under capitalism, there are no restrictions to the accumulation of wealth. And under socialism, there must be restrictions. So firms that get to be a certain size will have to be, in my view, nationalized or split up so that they're owned in small fractions by many people instead of by a small fraction of people who become very wealthy. I'm not saying we have to have only small firms. I'm saying that only small firms should be privately ownable. You can own a restaurant or a corner store or maybe even a firm that sells, has a sales of $100 million a year, but there should be a cap on what the size of firm that can be owned by an individual or a small number of people is. There should be a cap. So I think that's the big mistake that was made in socialism, and the Chinese reformed that in 1979. They decided to use markets, and their growth took off. Now, unfortunately, they're having a very sharp accumulation they're having a sharp development of inequality of wealth ownership and income in China. So they haven't stopped concentration, but I think that's a political issue. I don't think it's a question of it being impossible to control.
Also that you're just talking about the Chinese, they've got an unbalanced economy because they've relied on our consumer market and credit markets, which they finance, to relieve them of excess productivity. So how do they come back to a central tendency of balanced development? That's number one. But that's just a side comment. I also wanted to comment on the supply and demand idea, where demand is a key component of price. The Marxists would probably argue that supply and demand appears as a result of the prior mechanisms of capital and labor interacting with each other, so that the supply and demand generally is an effect of the exploitation of labor and the initial capitalist endowment. But that's a tough problem to prove or resolve. I know that that demand and the marginal principle, is much more robust in dealing with that. But a good Marxist would probably say, but supply and demand is just a surface manifestation of the deep underlying situation, and therefore it's the ultimate driver, and that the marginality principle and the demand principle is really pre-given by some deep performance of the system on the cost side. You want to make a comment on that, or just basically dismiss it?
I think that's vague. You're
Okay.
saying that supply and demand are ephemeral, and there's a deep underlying what? What's the deep underlying thing? Which is, we have determination of prices is a question of being able to have a theory of what the income distribution is going to be in a society. And I think general equilibrium theory is a crowning achievement of economics, and it gives us a pretty good explanation under certain conditions of what the income distribution will be, given the endowments of people and given their preferences and their needs. So I just think the Marxist approach was wrong-headed, and I don't see any reason. One doesn't have to endorse the labor theory of value or Marx's view of price determination to be a socialist or a left-winger or an egalitarian.
I think you've proven that.
One can understand that prices are not determined solely by labor content. They're determined also by demand, by people's needs and preferences, and be perfectly supportive of socialism. So it's an unnecessary accoutrement for progressive thinking and for socialist thinking, which is just not scientifically correct.
Okay, all right, because they would argue that those preferences are endogenously.
Well, they may be endogenous, sure. People have needs and preferences created by advertising and by the needs of capital. Okay, that's true, but it doesn't tell you that it's labor content that's determining their preferences. Well, so the labor theory of value isn't rescued by understanding that preferences are endogenous.
Well, you made the point.
Preferences might be somewhat different under socialism. It's still true that an awful lot of what people want and express preference for are basically needs of various kinds for shelter and education and food and security, and those things are pretty basic. And so I'm not one who thinks we're going to reform that the big problem of capitalism is the preferences are endogenous. I don't think that's the case.
Okay. Well, also you would argue that you could develop a banana theory of value if you had to.
That's true. You can show that any commodity must be exploited in the sense that it gives more value than it itself contains in a system in which there's going to be economic growth or profits. It's another way of saying it. So labor is not unique in that regard. One would have to find some other reason for labor's uniqueness. Now, there are other reasons. Labor is embodied in human beings, and steel and coal are not. But that doesn't mean that it's a better explanation of what prices are. The fact that labor is unique in certain regards that are very important to ourselves, to human beings, because producing labor involves personal involvement in the way that producing coal doesn't, perhaps.
Right.
Doesn't mean that that's the main explanation of how the economy works.
Okay, well, I think you made a telling point there. They would argue, a Marxist or a socialist may argue that because labor is so decisive in many ways, by shunting it aside and not having a labor theory of value, you're losing some of the ancillary focus. For example, the workplace. It's the workplace that labor sees itself being managed in some sense, and so they would feel it's all of a piece. That if labor was neutral, why does it have to be managed in the Braverman sense? Let's say.
So this is another point on which I disagree with Marxism. Marxism or a lot of Marxists in particular, there are certainly quotes from Marx to this effect, but also people like the Harry Braverman School, argued that the essence of capitalist exploitation and the secret of capitalist accumulation lay at the point of production. I don't agree with that. I think the main source of wealth accumulation and the secret of capital accumulation is in the distribution of assets. It's in the distribution of ownership. I don't believe it's at the point of production. I think the kinds of things that happen at the point of production, where bosses, make workers work faster and they mistreat them, and there's constant struggle at the point of production over how much labor is going to be extracted from the worker. I think those are secondary issues in capitalism. The reason there's a fight over the extraction of labor from labor power at the point of production is because it's impossible to write a perfect contract for the exchange of labor for the wage. Suppose we could write perfect and costlessly enforceable contracts. So whenever the contract was violated, the worker could snap his fingers, and it would be the contract would be instantly implemented. Boss would be fined if he asked the worker to work too fast.
You're onto something
Saturday.
because
Now let me just finish this point. So if that were so, there would be no action happening at the point of production. There wouldn't be anything interesting happening there. And I think that's the pure case of capitalism. Marx said he wanted to explain the accumulation of capital without resorting to cheating. He wanted to explain it in a system where all exchanges were by the books. And I think that means that he'd like to explain it in a world where there was none of this kind of petty stuff happening at the point of production. And there, the key explanation of capital accumulation is the distribution of capital and the distribution of wealth.
I think
you made
that point brilliantly. I believe, and I think for readers and listeners and viewers of this, John Roemer makes these points brilliantly in his book, and that's why it's so important. I mean, you have to come to grips with his book, as we're trying to do at the present time. But we'll kind of end it on this kind of note. I think you assert that aside from the workplace coercion, that because of the way capitalism works, the average person does not feel or see exploitation in any real sense.
That's right.
And unlike feudalism, where it's obvious because the peasant can see, I work one day for me, one day for him. I mean, where you have the split that's palpable. So I think you've made an interesting observation there that the exploitation is not observed in capitalism. Would you want to elaborate on that? Is that or is it self-evident?
Well, I think you said it correctly. I mean, the slave and the serf can see very clearly that they spend part of their week working, for their own subsistence. Let's say the feudal serf on his own family plot, and then they spend the rest of the week working for the lord or the master on his lands or in his mill. And so the division of the work week between reproduction of oneself and one's family, and on the other hand, producing goods for the Lord is very clear. Not so clear under capitalism. You spend the whole week putting on auto fenders. It's very hard to see. And then you take your wages and you buy your food. You didn't produce your food. So it becomes, Marx said there's a veil cast over the true social relations by the market mechanism and the division of labor. And I think that's a very apt point, a very important Marxist point. And the theory of exploitation that Marx proposed was trying to clarify the fact that what's happening under capitalism is very similar in terms of wealth distribution to what was happening under feudalism. Namely, the worker only works for his own reproduction for a certain part of the week, and for the rest of the week he's producing goods which are owned by the capitalist and sold for his own profit. I think that's an extremely valuable part of the theory. But it's interesting to say that part of the theory does not depend at all on the labor theory of value.
Right.
To show that that's true, You don't need to say, you can adopt the neoclassical theory of prices. So
Okay.
you don't have to maintain the false labor theory of value to maintain the truth of the fact that workers are, producing for profits and the boss for a certain fraction of the work week or the work year.
Okay. Well, of course, essentially, you're arguing that the unequal distribution of capital gives you a bargaining power advantage. That is a decisive variable at the end of the day that can't be gainsaid. Would that be a fair position?
Well, I mean, bargaining power is a kind of has a technical meaning in economics, and it implies that you're not in a market situation, that you're in a one-on-one situation bargaining with somebody. That's not the situation. I mean, so I wouldn't use bargaining power. I'd say that through the market, through the workings of demand and supply, those who end up with capital, if labor is relatively abundant, will end up getting a very large share of the social product. That's the way it works. Now, to understand how that happens, you have to do a little economic modeling. And I
Okay.
do that in the book that you
Yes,
talk
yes,
about. I
absolutely.
have a very simple model with a farm and a factory, and
Right, right.
and how the accumulation of capital occurs when labor is relatively abundant, and hence the wage is forced down to a wage that permits profits to go to the capitalists.
Well, pound for pound, you have a heavyweight book there, I have to tell you. That's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and past episodes, please go to our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. I'm Andrew Mazzone, and thank you for watching Smart Talk.